1966, Yorkshire, England, Pritchard family, the case that the British press documented, and the Black Monk never left. In the heart of Yorkshire County, where ancient stones whisper secrets of centuries past, stands the small town of Pontefract, a locality that holds within its depths a history as dark as it is fascinating. Long before the Pritchard family set foot in number 30 East Drive, this piece of land was already marked by tragedy and death. Pontefract is a town that breathes history. Its origins date back to pre-Roman times, and for centuries it witnessed battles, executions, and suffering. In the town center still stand the ruins of an ancient Cluniac priory, where hooded monks walked in silence between stone walls. Not far away, the medieval castle of Pontefract rises as a perpetual reminder of the power and violence that once dominated these lands. But there is a detail that few know, a secret buried beneath decades of construction and modernity. On the hill where the Chequerfield Estate housing development now stands, precisely where East Drive was built, there stood in the 16th century the gallows of Pontefract. It was a small hill, strategically located at a crossroads, following the ancient tradition of confusing the spirits of those executed so they could not find their way back and return to the place of their crime to haunt it. During the reign of Henry VIII, when the English Reformation was tearing the country apart and the Catholic Church was losing its absolute power, many monks were persecuted, tried, and executed. The historical records of Pontefract, jealously guarded in the local library archives, reveal that on those gallows a Cluniac monk was executed. His crime had been atrocious, the rape and murder of a young girl. The monk was tried, condemned, and hanged on that hill, his body swaying in the wind as a warning to all who passed through the crossroads. According to local legends that the elderly of Pontefract still remember, the monk's body never received Christian burial. It was thrown into an ancient stone well that existed nearby, left there to rot in darkness, without the blessings that his religious order would have required. That well was covered over time, forgotten, buried beneath the earth as the centuries advanced. Let us now jump to the year 1945. World War II had just ended and Great Britain needed to rebuild itself. The Labour government implemented an ambitious housing program, building thousands of homes to accommodate families who had lost their homes during the bombing or who simply needed a decent place to live. Thus was born Chequerfield Estate, one of the largest social housing developments in Europe at that time. The houses went up quickly, rows and rows of red brick semi-detached houses, all identical, all practical and functional. Small front gardens, small back gardens, 2 floors, 3 bedrooms. Number 30 East Drive was built in 1953, right on the upper corner of the hill, in the exact place where the medieval gallows once stood. For more than a decade, several families lived at number 30 without incidents. It was a normal house on a normal street in a normal housing development. Children played football in the street, mothers hung laundry in the back gardens, fathers worked in the nearby factories and mines. Yorkshire was a tough region of working people, practical, without time for nonsense or superstitions. But in August of 1966, everything changed forever. Joe Pritchard was a sturdy man, 38 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had worked all his life with his hands. A truck driver, Joe was known in Pontefract as an honest man, straightforward, without imagination. He was not the type of person who would believe in ghosts or fairy tales. Jean, his wife, was 35 years old and the soul of the home. A meticulous housewife, proud of keeping her house spotless, Jean was a practical woman and devout Catholic, who attended Mass every Sunday at the Church of All Saints. The couple had 2 children. Phillip, 15 years old, was a typical teenager of the 60s, long hair, lover of rock and roll, dreaming of escaping the monotonous life of Yorkshire. Diane, the youngest, was 12 years old. She was a quiet child, somewhat shy, who loved to read and draw in her room. She wore her brown hair tied in pigtails and her large brown eyes looked at the world with a mixture of curiosity and caution. When the Pritchards moved to number 30 East Drive in August of 1966, they were filled with hope. Finally they would have a home of their own, even if it was rented from the council. The furniture was modest but sufficient: a brown fabric sofa in the living room, a wooden dining table, a dresser in the master bedroom. On the wall hung framed family photographs, including Joe and Jean's wedding photo, taken 15 years earlier. The house had a typical layout of the social housing of the era. On the ground floor, a small entrance hallway, a living room with fireplace, a narrow kitchen, and attached to one side of the house, a flat-roofed extension that contained a small coal room, dark and cold, where fuel had once been stored before piped gas arrived at the housing development. Upstairs, 3 small bedrooms and a bathroom. The stairs, steep and narrow, connected both floors with a wooden railing that creaked when leaning on it. August of 1966 was a hot month in Yorkshire, unusually sunny for a region known for its grey and rainy weather. The 30th of August fell on a public holiday, the summer bank holiday, when British families took advantage to rest before the return to school and work. That day Joe and Jean had decided to enjoy the good weather in the small back garden. They had spread some blankets on the lawn and were sunbathing, reading the newspaper, drinking tea. Phillip was with them, lying on the grass with his eyes closed, listening to music on his small transistor radio. Diane had gone out to play with the neighborhood friends. Inside the house, in the living room with the curtains drawn to keep the heat out, was grandmother Sarah Scholes, Jean's mother. Sarah was 63 years old, a petite but strong-willed woman, also pure Yorkshire. She had come to spend a few days with the family to help with the move and get to know the new house. Sitting on the sofa, Sarah was quietly knitting a blue wool cardigan for Diane, her needles moving with the hypnotic rhythm of decades of practice. Suddenly Sarah felt a chill. The air inside the living room, which had been hot and stifling, became freezing in a matter of seconds. It was as if someone had opened the door of a giant freezer. Sarah stopped knitting and looked around, confused. There were no open windows, no drafts. The chill ran down her back. Then she saw something that made her stop completely, with her needles suspended in the air. From a point located just below the ceiling, but not from the ceiling itself, a fine layer of white dust began to fall. It was not plaster dust, not construction dust. It was something finer, like talcum powder, like whitish ash. It fell slowly, forming a uniform layer over the living room carpet. Sarah called Phillip. The boy came running from the garden, followed by his parents. The four of them stood in the living room, watching in disbelief as the dust continued to fall gently, accumulating on the floor. Joe touched the ceiling, looking for cracks, holes, any logical explanation. He found nothing. The ceiling was perfectly sealed, painted just a few months earlier by the council workers. Jean, practical as always, went to get the broom and started sweeping the dust, trying to normalize everything. But while she swept, the dust kept falling, replacing what she was cleaning. It was like trying to empty the sea with a bucket. It was then that Phillip pointed toward the kitchen. On the linoleum floor, right in the center of the kitchen, a puddle of water had appeared. It was a perfectly round puddle, without splashes, without drops around it. As if someone had carefully poured water from a jug, forming a perfect circle. Joe knelt down and touched the water. It was cold, completely normal. He looked up, searching for a leak in the ceiling, a broken pipe. Nothing. He looked under the sink, checked all the visible pipes. Everything was dry and in perfect condition. The puddle had simply appeared out of nowhere. Sarah Scholes, with her protective grandmother instinct, began to feel growing unease. Something was not right in this house. Something that could not be explained with logic or reason. But this was Yorkshire, it was 1966, and the practical people of Yorkshire did not believe in ghosts or unexplainable phenomena. There had to be a rational explanation. Joe called the council water service. A plumber arrived that same afternoon, checked the entire house from top to bottom, inspected the pipes, joints, ceiling, floor. His verdict was clear and puzzling. There was no water leak. There was no explanation for that puddle that kept appearing again and again, always in the same place, always perfectly round. That night, when the family gathered for dinner, no one talked much about what had happened. Jean had cleaned everything several times, the dust had stopped falling, the last puddle had been dried. They tried to convince themselves that it had been something strange but unimportant, a coincidence, a rare atmospheric phenomenon caused by the unusual heat. But deep down, somewhere deep in their minds, they all knew that something had begun. Something they could not stop, something that would turn their dream of a quiet home into a living nightmare that would last for years. Number 30 East Drive had awakened, and the Black Monk of Pontefract, after 4 centuries of waiting underground, was ready to claim what he considered his. The Pritchard family, honest, hardworking, unpretentious, was about to become the protagonist of one of the most violent and best documented poltergeist cases in all of British history. And Diane, the quiet 12-year-old girl with pigtails and brown eyes, would become the center of a terror that no child should ever experience. The days following that strange 30th of August 1966 passed with a deceptive calm. The Pritchard family tried to resume their daily routine, convincing themselves that the incidents of the first day had been an unimportant anomaly. After all, they were sensible people from Yorkshire, and Yorkshire was no place for superstitions or ghost stories. Joe Pritchard got up every morning at 5:30. The alarm clock rang with its shrill bell on the nightstand of the master bedroom, and Joe, faithful to his disciplined nature, never needed it to ring twice. He dressed silently so as not to wake Jean, went down the stairs that creaked under his weight, and prepared his thermos of hot tea in the kitchen. By 6 o'clock he was already outside the house, walking through the still dark streets of Pontefract toward the garage where they kept the trucks for the transport company he worked for. Joe had been driving trucks since he was 18 years old. He had traveled every road in Yorkshire, knew every town, every shortcut, every gas station in the county. It was hard but honest work, which paid him enough to support his family with dignity. On Fridays, when he received his envelope with the weekly salary, he handed it to Jean, who managed every shilling and every penny with the precision of an accountant. Jean Pritchard was the heart and soul of number 30 East Drive. While Joe spent long hours on the road, Jean kept the house running like a Swiss watch. She got up at 7, prepared breakfast for the children, sent them off to school with their impeccable uniforms and their sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. Then she began her daily cleaning routine. Cleaning was almost a religion for Jean. Every Monday she washed all the week's laundry, using the drum washing machine that had been one of the luxuries the couple had allowed themselves when moving. Every Tuesday she ironed, leaving every shirt, every skirt, every pair of trousers perfectly smooth. On Wednesdays she thoroughly cleaned the ground floor, vacuuming, waxing the floors, dusting every surface. On Thursdays it was the upper floor's turn: bedrooms, bathrooms, stairs. On Fridays she shopped at the local market, filling her cloth bags with fresh vegetables, meat from the butcher, freshly baked bread. Number 30 had a characteristic aroma, a mixture of furniture wax, lavender detergent, and the perpetual stew that Jean always had simmering on low heat in the kitchen. It was a smell of home, of security, of normal British working-class life. Saturdays were different. Joe did not work on Saturdays and the family enjoyed a more relaxed pace. In the morning, Joe took care of the garden. He mowed the lawn with the manual mower, trimmed the hedges, pulled the weeds. Jean baked a cake or prepared scones for afternoon tea. The children had freedom to play with their neighborhood friends or, in Philip's case, listen to music in his room for hours, something that irritated his father, but Jean defended, saying the boys needed their space. Sundays were sacred. The whole family attended 11 o'clock Mass at the Church of All Saints, the same church whose bells had rung for centuries over Pontefract. Jean wore her best dress, Joe his only suit, and the children their Sunday clothes. After Mass, they often visited relatives or received visits at home. Grandmother Sarah frequently came for Sunday tea, always bringing some homemade cake or biscuits she had baked. Philip Pritchard, at his 15 years, was at that awkward age between childhood and adulthood. Tall and gangly, with hair too long according to his father but fashionable according to him, Philip dreamed of escaping Pontefract. He adored music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks. He had saved for months to buy his own transistor radio, and kept it as a treasure under his pillow every night. Philip attended Pontefract Secondary School, where he was a mediocre student. He was not particularly interested in mathematics or history, but he had talent for technical drawing. His teacher had suggested he consider a career in architecture or engineering, but Philip was not sure of anything. The only thing he knew for certain was that he did not want to end up driving trucks like his father, although he had never said so out loud. He shared a room with his sister Diane, something both detested. The room was small, with 2 single beds separated by a nightstand. Philip had hung posters of his favorite bands on his side of the room, while Diane had decorated her side with drawings of horses and ballerinas. An improvised curtain divided the space, giving each of them an illusion of privacy. Diane Pritchard was a quiet and dreamy child. At her 12 years, she was at that delicate moment just before adolescence, when the childhood world begins to fade but the adult world still seems distant and incomprehensible. She was petite for her age, with brown hair that her mother insisted on keeping long and braided. Her large brown eyes observed everything with an intensity that sometimes unsettled Jean. Diane loved to read. The local Pontefract library was her favorite refuge, and every week she took out the maximum number of books allowed. She read everything: adventures, mysteries, fairy tales. Her teacher had praised her for her creative writing, saying she had a vivid imagination and a natural talent for words. Diane kept a secret diary under her mattress, where she wrote poems and little stories, some cheerful, others surprisingly dark for a 12-year-old girl. At school, Diane was invisible. She was not popular or unpopular, she simply went unnoticed. She had 2 close friends, Susan and Margaret, with whom she played during recess, but she had never been invited to the birthday parties of the more popular girls. That did not seem to bother her much. Diane preferred her inner world of books and dreams to the social complications of school. What no one knew, not even her parents, was that Diane had begun to experience something strange in the weeks before the move. Vivid, disturbing dreams. In those dreams, she walked through a dark house she did not recognize, pursued by a tall figure dressed in black. She always woke up just before the figure reached her, with her heart pounding in her chest. She had tried to tell her mother once, but Jean had dismissed her concerns, saying they were silly nightmares caused by reading too much before sleeping. The neighbors on East Drive were typical of a British social housing development of the 60s. At number 28 lived the Nottingham family: Vic, a burly bricklayer with huge, calloused hands, his wife Peggy, and their 3 noisy children who played football in the street every afternoon. Vic and Joe had quickly become friends, united by that natural camaraderie between working men who share the same struggles. On the other side, at number 32, lived Mrs. Mountain, a 70-year-old widow who spent most of her time spying on the neighbors from behind her lace curtains. She was the type of neighbor who knew everything that happened on the street before anyone else, and who did not hesitate to share her unsolicited opinions about how others should raise their children or maintain their gardens. The event that really marked the beginning of the Pritchards' move was a family meal held on the first Sunday of September. Jean had prepared a traditional Yorkshire roast: beef, fluffy Yorkshire pudding, roast potatoes, carrots and peas, all bathed in a thick, tasty gravy. Grandmother Sarah had come, along with Joe's brother, Robert, his wife Mary, and their 2 young children. The house was full of laughter, overlapping conversations, the clinking of cutlery against plates. It was exactly the type of family gathering that Jean adored. Her house full of people she loved, abundant food on the table, the warm feeling of belonging and tradition. Robert and Joe talked about football at one end of the table, while Sarah and Mary discussed the best way to make strawberry jam. The children had finished eating quickly and ran around the garden, playing hide and seek among the bushes. Everything was perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe. After the meal, while Jean and Mary washed the dishes in the kitchen and the men smoked cigarettes in the garden, Diane went up to her room to look for a book she wanted to lend to her cousin. She entered the room and stopped dead in her tracks. The heavy oak dresser she shared with Phillip, which had always been against the wall between the 2 beds, had moved. Not much, perhaps 30 centimeters, but enough to be obvious. It was now in the middle of the room, partially blocking the door. Diane ran down the stairs, calling her mother. Jean came up, followed by Joe and Robert. The 3 adults looked at the dresser, then looked at each other. Joe tried to push it back into place. It was heavy, very heavy, full of clothes. He needed all his strength to move it, leaving marks on the carpet where it had been and where it was now. Robert suggested that perhaps the floor was uneven and the dresser had rolled on its own. Joe checked the floor with the spirit level he had in his toolbox. The floor was perfectly level. Moreover, the thick carpet would have made it impossible for such a heavy piece of furniture to move on its own. Jean, always practical, suggested that perhaps Phillip had moved the dresser before going out to the garden, although it made no sense that he would have done so. Phillip, when questioned, flatly denied having touched the furniture. Why would he have moved it? He had no reason to do so. The explanation hung in the air, unresolved. It was strange, yes, but what else could they do? They returned downstairs, where Sarah was preparing tea and bringing out the cake she had brought. The conversation returned to normal topics: work, school, the neighbors, the weather. But that night, when everyone had left and the family was preparing for sleep, Jean confessed to Joe in whispers that she was uneasy. First the dust, then the water, now furniture moving on its own. Joe, with his characteristic Yorkshire pragmatism, reassured her. There had to be logical explanations for everything. Perhaps there were strange air currents in the new house. Perhaps the pipes did strange things they did not yet understand. Perhaps Phillip had moved the dresser and did not want to admit it to avoid getting in trouble. Jean wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. Because the alternative, the idea that something unnatural was occurring in their new, clean house, in the house they had worked so hard for, was too disturbing to contemplate. That night, Diane had another nightmare. She dreamed she was in her room, but it was not really her room. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. The dresser was moving on its own, crawling across the floor like a living creature. And in the corner, wrapped in shadows darker than the darkness itself, was a tall figure. She could not see its face, only the shape of a hood, of dark robes, of something ancient and full of anger. She woke up screaming. Jean ran to her room, hugged her, stroked her hair until she calmed down. "It's just a dream, darling," Jean whispered. "Just a silly dream. It can't hurt you." But Diane knew, with that instinctive certainty that children sometimes have, that it was not just a dream. Something had awakened in number 30 East Drive. Something that had been waiting a long time. And now that it had found the perfect family, it had no intention of letting them go. The normal life of the Pritchards, with its comforting routines and working-class sensibleness, was about to completely fall apart. The month of September would bring with it not only the change of season and the return to classes, but the beginning of a terror that would turn their home into a battlefield between the physical world and something much older, much darker, and much hungrier than any of them could have ever imagined. September of 1966 arrived with the typical changing weather of Yorkshire. The sunny days of August gave way to cool mornings and rainy afternoons. The leaves on the trees lining Chequerfield Estate began to turn yellow and brown. The children returned to school with their freshly washed uniforms and their backpacks full of new notebooks. Life at number 30 East Drive seemed to have settled into a quiet routine. But appearances were deceiving. The first truly disturbing incident occurred on the afternoon of Thursday the 7th of September. Jean was alone at home, Joe working on some distant road, the children still at school. She had spent the morning cleaning the ground floor and was now in the kitchen, preparing a teapot for her mid-afternoon break. It was approximately 3 in the afternoon, sunlight entering weakly through the kitchen window, casting elongated shadows over the linoleum. Jean filled the electric kettle with water from the tap, placed it on its base by the window and pressed the switch. The red light came on, indicating that the water was boiling. She turned toward the cupboard to take out a cup and the tea. Then she heard a click. Then another. Then another. She turned around and saw something that left her frozen. The kettle switch was moving on its own. Down. On off. On off. The red light blinked to the rhythm of the clicks. Click 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 click. Jean stood paralyzed, looking at the kettle as if it were a poisonous snake. The switch kept moving, up and down, with a mechanical and deliberate rhythm. There was no way it could move on its own. It was a simple switch, requiring physical pressure to change position. And yet, there it was, moving as if invisible fingers were operating it. "Stop it!" shouted Jean, surprising herself with her own outburst. Her voice echoed in the empty kitchen. The switch stopped immediately. The red light remained on, the water began to boil normally. Jean stood there, breathing heavily, with her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked around the kitchen, expecting to see, what? Someone hiding? An explanation? There was nothing. Only her and the oppressive silence of the empty house. That night, when Joe came home, Jean told him what had happened. Joe carefully checked the kettle. The switch worked perfectly, without any mechanical fault. He suggested that perhaps there was an intermittent electrical short circuit. The next day, an electrician from the council came to check all the house wiring. His diagnosis was clear. Everything was in perfect order. There was no electrical problem. 2 days later, on Saturday the 9th of September, something occurred that involved the whole family. It was mid-morning, Joe was in the back garden mowing the lawn, Jean was hanging clothes on the line, and the children were inside the house. Phillip was in the living room watching television and Diane was in her room reading. Suddenly, a thunderous crash shook the entire house. It sounded as if someone had dropped a piano from the ceiling. The pictures on the walls trembled. The floor vibrated. Joe dropped the lawnmower and ran toward the house, followed by Jean. Inside, Phillip was standing in the living room, pale as a ghost, looking up at the ceiling. Diane had run down the stairs, with her eyes wide open with terror. They all looked at each other, then looked upward. The noise had come from the upper floor. The 4 of them climbed the stairs together, prepared to find, they did not know what. A hole in the ceiling? Something fallen? They checked each room carefully. There was nothing out of place. Nothing had fallen, nothing was broken, nothing had changed. And yet they had all clearly heard that massive crash. Joe went out to talk to the neighbors. Vic Nottingham from number 28 had also heard it. He was sure the noise had come from number 30. Mrs. Mountain from number 32 had thought it was thunder, but the sky was completely clear. That night, while the family ate dinner in uncomfortable silence, they heard the noises again. This time they were different. Not a crash but knocks. Loud, rhythmic knocks coming from the walls. Knock knock knock. Knock knock knock. As if someone were knocking on the door, but the sound came from inside the walls themselves. Joe got up and put his hand against the living room wall. He could feel the vibrations under his palm. He knocked on the wall with his knuckles, trying to locate a hollow space, a pipe, something that would explain the sound. The knocks responded, imitating his pattern. When Joe knocked 3 times, the knocks in the wall responded with 3 knocks. When he knocked 4 times, the response was 4 knocks. It was as if something or someone were playing with him. The night of Sunday the 10th of September marked a turning point. Diane had gone to bed early, exhausted after a difficult week at school. Jean had tucked her in, given her a kiss on the forehead, and gone down to watch television with Joe and Philip. At approximately 10 at night, they heard a scream. It was Diane screaming with absolute terror. The three of them ran upstairs, almost tripping over each other in their haste. They burst into the children's room and turned on the light. Diane was standing on her bed, pressed against the wall, pointing at her dresser. The dresser was open. All the drawers were completely open, as if someone had pulled them all out at once with a violent tug. The clothes were scattered on the floor. Socks, underwear, t-shirts, everything jumbled in complete chaos. "It wasn't me," shouted Diane, with tears running down her cheeks. "I was asleep. I woke up and all the drawers were open. I didn't open them." Jean hugged her daughter while Joe and Philip inspected the room. The drawers were fully extended, some almost falling off the dresser. To open them all like that would have required much strength and several minutes of deliberate work. And Diane had been asleep. That was obvious from her state of confusion and terror. That night, Diane slept in her parents' room, curled up between Joe and Jean, trembling every time she heard a creak in the house. Philip stayed awake in his room with the light on, wondering what the hell was happening in his house. The incidents began to accelerate. Every day brought something new, something inexplicable. On Tuesday the 12th of September, Jean found all the plants in the house out of their pots. Not toppled, but carefully extracted, with the soil forming perfect mounds next to each empty pot. The plants were placed beside them with their roots exposed, slowly withering. On Wednesday the 13th of September, Joe arrived home from work and found all the keys in the house scattered on the kitchen floor. Door keys, cupboard keys, keys they did not even know they had. But the strangest thing was the keys he did not recognize, ancient, rusty keys of a design he had never seen. Keys that seemed to be centuries old. On Thursday the 14th of September, Philip was doing his homework in the living room when a glass of milk he had left on the coffee table simply rose into the air. It did not fall, it did not slide. It rose, floating about 30 centimeters above the table, stayed suspended there for about 5 seconds that seemed like an eternity, and then tipped over, spilling the milk onto the carpet before falling. Philip remained paralyzed, staring at the fallen glass, the milk soaking the carpet. Then he ran out of the house and did not return until Joe came home from work. On Friday the 15th of September, Jean was peeling potatoes in the kitchen when she felt something wet on her head. She raised her hand and found it wet. She looked up and saw something that made her scream. From the kitchen tap, although it was closed, a green, foamy substance was dripping. It was not water. It was something viscous like soap foam but of a bright, unnatural green. It dripped slowly, forming a green puddle in the sink. Joe called the plumber again. The plumber completely dismantled the tap, checked the pipes, the water supply. There was nothing in the system that could produce that green substance. The water coming from the tap was completely normal and clean. The neighbors began to notice that something strange was happening at number 30. Vic Nottingham had seen lights turning on and off in the house windows when he knew no one was home. Mrs. Mountain had heard the knocks in the walls, so loud that she thought the Pritchards were doing renovations at late hours of the night. On Sunday the 17th of September after Mass, Jean had a conversation with Father O'Brien, the parish priest. She told him, in embarrassed whispers, about the strange things that were occurring in her house. Father O'Brien, an older man of Irish origin with decades of pastoral experience, listened with attention and growing concern. "It could be a poltergeist," he finally said, using a word Jean had never heard before. "A restless spirit or disturbed energy. It's not uncommon in houses where there are teenagers. The energy of young people can sometimes manifest in strange ways." He offered to come to the house to bless it. Jean accepted gratefully, clinging to any possible solution. Father O'Brien arrived at number 30 on Wednesday the 20th of September at 6 in the evening. He wore his purple stole, a worn Bible and a bottle of holy water. Jean had cleaned the house from top to bottom, as if polished furniture and waxed floors could somehow make the blessing more effective. Father O'Brien began in the living room, reciting prayers in Latin, sprinkling holy water in the corners of each room. Joe and Jean followed him respectfully, with Philip and Diane waiting nervously in the hallway. The priest went up the stairs, blessing each bedroom, the bathroom, even the attic. Everything seemed to be going well until they reached the small coal room, that flat-roofed extension on the side of the house. It was a dark and cold room, barely bigger than a closet, where coal for the fireplace had once been stored. Now it was practically empty, only with some old boxes and garden tools. When Father O'Brien entered that room, he stopped dead. His face visibly paled. "There is something here," he murmured. "Something very strong, very ancient, and very angry." He sprinkled holy water generously throughout the small room, reciting prayers with increasingly loud and urgent voice. He finished making the sign of the cross in the air and quickly left the room, closing the door firmly behind him. "Keep that door closed," he warned the family, "and if possible don't go in there." That night, after Father O'Brien left, the family ate dinner in silence. They all felt relieved that the house had been blessed, hoping it would put an end to the strange phenomena. Jean went to sleep feeling calmer than she had been in weeks. But at 3 in the morning, they all woke to the sound of something dragging across the ceiling. They were not normal footsteps. It was the sound of something heavy dragging slowly, scraping against the ceiling just above their heads. The sound moved from the master bedroom toward the children's room, then back again and again. And then the knocks started again. But this time they were louder, more violent, more furious, as if something were hitting the walls with invisible hammers. Knock, 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 knock. Louder each time, faster, more aggressive. The framed photographs on the walls began to tremble. One fell to the floor with a crash, the glass shattered. It was the photo of Joe and Jean's wedding, the precious photograph that Jean kept on the wall of the upper hallway. Joe got out of bed and turned on the light. The knocks continued. He checked each room looking for the source of the noise. There was nothing visible, nothing that could be causing those sounds. But the knocks continued, relentless, enraged. In the children's room, Diane had gotten under the covers, covering her ears, sobbing. Phillip was sitting rigidly in his bed, pale and trembling. Jean tried to comfort both of them, but she herself was on the verge of tears. The knocks continued for more than an hour. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was a dense, charged silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The next morning, Jean called Father O'Brien again. When she told him what had happened, the priest sighed deeply. "The blessing seems to have enraged it," he said. "Whatever is in your house, it doesn't want to leave. And now it's angry." He suggested that she contact the Society for Psychical Research, an organization that investigated paranormal phenomena. He also mentioned that perhaps it would be prudent to consider moving, although he did not say so explicitly. But Jean refused to move. They had worked too hard to get this house. It was their home. She was not going to let anything, not even something she could not see or understand, throw her out of her own house. That decision, though admirable in its stubbornness, would be something she would regret in the coming months. Because the phenomena they had experienced so far were only the prelude, the first tentative movements of something that was testing the limits, learning how to interact with the physical world, gathering strength. What would come next would make those first incidents seem like child's play. The poltergeist that the family had begun to call Fred, in a desperate attempt to normalize the abnormal and take away its power through humor, was barely warming up. And its focus, its main target, was already clear to everyone in the house. It was Diane. Always Diane. The quiet 12-year-old girl with frightened brown eyes and frayed pigtails. For some reason no one could understand, Fred had chosen Diane as the center of its attention. And that attention, in the coming weeks, would become increasingly intense, more personal and more terrifying. The neighbors on East Drive had begun to talk in whispers about the strange house at number 30. The children on the street began to avoid playing near that corner. Mrs. Mountain told anyone who would listen about the devilish noises coming from the Pritchard house at all hours. And in the Pontefract library, if anyone had known where to look, they would have found the old records that told the story of the monk executed on the gallows that once stood exactly where number 30 now was. The monk who had committed the horrible crime of raping and murdering a young girl. A girl who, according to the records, was approximately 12 years old, the same age as Diane Pritchard. October of 1966 arrived in Pontefract with cold winds and gray skies. Dead leaves swirled in the streets of Checkerfield Estate, accumulating in corners and against doors. At number 30 East Drive, the Pritchard family felt as if they were living inside a nightmare from which they could not wake. The phenomena were no longer isolated incidents that could be rationalized or ignored. Now they were constant, relentless, increasingly violent. And everyone in the house knew that something terrible was building toward a crescendo. The first week of October brought with it a dramatic escalation in activity. On Monday the 2nd of October, Jean was preparing dinner in the kitchen when the cupboards began to open and close violently. Not one or two, but all at once. The wooden doors banged against their frames with a deafening crash. Bim 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 bim. Jean backed up against the wall, with the kitchen knife still in her hand, watching terrified as the cupboards opened and closed like hungry mouths. When Joe came home that night, he found Jean sitting in the living room, still wearing her apron, staring into space. She had not cooked dinner. She had not finished cooking. She had simply sat there in a state of shock for hours. On Wednesday the 4th of October, Philip was alone at home after school. He was in his room, listening to music on his transistor radio, trying to do his math homework. Suddenly he felt something cold on the back of his neck. A blast of freezing air, like a breath. He turned around quickly, but there was no one behind him. Then he saw his reflection in the mirror hanging on the wall. But he was not alone in the reflection. Behind him, in the mirror, there was a dark figure. Tall, wrapped in what appeared to be black robes, with a hood that completely hid its face. The figure was motionless, simply standing, watching him. Philip screamed and turned around. There was no one behind him. The room was empty. But when he looked at the mirror again, the figure was still there, in the reflection, though it did not exist in the real room. Philip ran out of the house and did not return until his parents arrived. On Friday the 6th of October, Diane experienced the most terrifying incident up to that point. It was approximately 8 at night. She was in the bathroom, brushing her teeth before going to bed. The bathroom door was closed but not locked. Suddenly, she felt something grab her ankle. She looked down and saw a hand. A pale hand, almost translucent, emerging from the floor itself as if the linoleum were water. The fingers were long and bony, the nails yellowed and cracked. The hand squeezed tightly, so tight it left red marks on her skin. Diane screamed with all her might. Joe burst into the bathroom, almost breaking the door in his haste. Diane was standing on the toilet lid, shaking uncontrollably, pointing at the floor. But when Joe looked, there was nothing. Only the normal linoleum without any disturbance. However, when Diane took off her sock, they could all clearly see the marks on her ankle. 5 red marks, perfectly spaced, exactly where the fingers of a hand would have been. The marks remained visible for 3 days. That night, Jean called Father O'Brien again. The priest, with a grave and worried voice, explained to her that this went beyond his capabilities. He recommended contacting specialized investigators. He also suggested, with much more insistence this time, that they seriously consider moving from the house. But Jean continued to refuse. This was their house. They were not going to let anything throw them out. On Saturday the 7th of October, the family received an unexpected visit. Tom Cuniff, a local paranormal investigator who had read about the incidents in the Pontefract and Castleford Express. The local press had begun to cover the story after neighbors talked to a journalist, appeared at their door. He was a man of about 45 years with thick-framed glasses and a briefcase full of strange equipment: thermometers, cameras, audio recorders. Tom spent the entire day in the house, taking meticulous notes, photographing each room, measuring temperatures. He installed a recorder in the coal room, that small dark space that Father O'Brien had identified as particularly disturbing. During the first hours, nothing unusual happened. Tom began to wonder if the whole story was an exaggeration or even a hoax. But then, at approximately 5 in the afternoon, when daylight was beginning to fade, things changed. They were all sitting in the living room. The Pritchard family, Tom Cuniff and Vic Nottingham from number 28, who had come to support his neighbors. Suddenly, a flower vase that was on the fireplace mantel rose into the air. It did not fall, it did not slide. It rose gently, as if an invisible hand had picked it up, floated across the room for about 5 seconds, and then crashed violently against the opposite wall, shattering. The water and flowers spilled onto the floor. Tom ran to grab his camera, but by the time he had it ready, the phenomenon had ended. However, everyone in the room had seen it. 6 eyewitnesses, including an experienced paranormal investigator and a skeptical neighbor. It could not be denied, could not be explained as hallucination or collective hysteria. That night, Tom reviewed the audio recording he had left in the coal room. What he heard left him frozen. During the hours the recorder had been running, it had captured voices. They were not clear or easy to understand voices, but low whispers, growls, and at one point, what sounded disturbingly like a deep, malevolent laugh. But the most disturbing thing came toward the end of the recording. A voice, clearer than the others, whispered 3 words in Old English that Tom could barely decipher: "Beware of grandfather." Or at least that is what it seemed to say. Although no one in the Pritchard family had a living grandfather who could be a threat. Tom promised to return with more equipment and possibly with colleagues from the Society for Psychical Research. But he also warned the family that what was happening in their house was extraordinarily rare and potentially dangerous. Most poltergeist cases, he explained, involved annoying but relatively harmless phenomena that eventually disappeared. This was different. This was aggressive, directed, and intensifying. On Sunday the 8th of October, the family did not go to Mass for the first time in years. They were too exhausted, too frightened to leave the house together, fearing what they might find when they returned. That afternoon, something happened that would forever change the dynamic in the house. Jean was in the kitchen trying to prepare the traditional Sunday lunch, desperately clinging to any appearance of normalcy. Suddenly, she felt something pull her hair. Not a gentle tug, but a violent and painful pull that made her scream and fall to her knees. Jo ran to the kitchen and found Jean on the floor, with her hands on her head, sobbing. Several strands of her hair had been torn out by the roots. Jo could see small drops of blood on her scalp where the hair had been forcefully ripped out. It was at that moment, kneeling beside his terrified wife on the kitchen floor, that Joe Pritchard finally accepted that he could not protect his family from this. He could not fix it with his hands or his Yorkshire pragmatism. They needed help, real help, from people who understood what was happening. The second week of October brought with it a series of incidents that would be meticulously documented by investigators now regularly visiting the house. Colin Wilson, the famous British author specializing in the paranormal and occult, became interested in the case and began collecting testimonies. On Monday the 9th of October, the house lights began to turn on and off uncontrollably. Not just in one room but throughout the entire house simultaneously. The electrical panel, which was inside a locked cupboard in the hallway, was found with the main switch moving up and down on its own. Joe changed the cupboard lock. The next night he found the cupboard door completely torn off its hinges, thrown on the hallway floor. On Tuesday the 10th of October, Diane was attacked again. She was sleeping in her bed when something grabbed her by the ankles and dragged her violently toward the foot of the bed. Her screams woke the entire family. When Joe came running into the room, Diane was desperately clinging to her bed's headboard, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. She had scratch marks on her legs as if invisible fingers had dug into her flesh while dragging her. That night, Diane refused to sleep in her room. She settled on the living room sofa with all the lights on, while Jean sat beside her, stroking her hair, singing her lullabies like when she was little. On Wednesday the 11th of October marked the clearest and most terrifying appearance of the Black Monk. It was approximately 11 at night. Joe and Jean were in their bed, still awake, talking in whispers about what to do, whether they should move, whether they should take the children to stay with relatives. The room was illuminated only by the moonlight entering through the window. Then Jean saw it. At the foot of their bed, materializing slowly as if emerging from fog, there was a figure. It was tall, very tall, more than 2 meters. It wore what appeared to be black monastic robes, with a deep hood that completely hid the face. Where the face should have been, there was only an impenetrable darkness, blacker than the night itself. Jean grabbed Joe's arm, squeezing it so hard she left bruises. "Joe," she whispered, her voice broken by terror. "Do you see it?" Joe sat up slowly without taking his eyes off the figure. "Yes," he said simply. "I see it." The figure did not move. It simply stood there watching them. Jean could feel its gaze, though she could not see eyes. It was a malevolent presence, ancient, filled with an anger that seemed to have no end. The air in the room became freezing. Their breath came out in clouds of vapor. Joe, gathering all his courage, spoke. "What do you want? Why are you in our house?" The figure did not respond. But slowly, very slowly, it raised an arm. From inside the habit's sleeves, a hand emerged. It was cadaverous, with gray, parchment-like skin stretched over bones. It pointed directly toward the hallway, toward the room where Diane was sleeping on the sofa. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. It did not walk away, did not gradually dissolve. It simply ceased to be there, as if someone had flipped a switch. Joe and Jean sat in their bed, trembling, clutching each other. They did not sleep at all that night. They stayed awake with all the lights on, waiting for dawn. The next morning, Joe called work saying he was ill. He gathered the entire family in the living room and told them they were going to temporarily move in with grandmother Sarah. They needed to get out of the house, even if only for a few days, to regroup and decide what to do. But when they tried to pack, Fred became furious. The suitcases Jean took out of the closet opened on their own, the clothes she put in flew out. The knocks on the walls became deafening. Objects flew through the air. Books, shoes, plates. It was as if the house itself were having a tantrum, refusing to let them leave. Finally, they managed to get out of the house, taking only the essentials. They spent 3 days at grandmother Sarah's house, sleeping on mattresses on the floor, trying to process what had been happening to them. During those 3 days, Tom Cuniff and his team stayed at number 30, monitoring the activity. They installed cameras, recorders, thermometers in every room. They wanted to scientifically document what was occurring. What they captured in those 72 hours would become one of the most extensive collections of paranormal evidence ever gathered. The cameras captured objects moving without physical contact. The recorders captured voices, knocks, the sound of heavy footsteps in empty rooms. The thermometers recorded temperature drops of up to 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, without any obvious source of cold. But the most disturbing was a series of photographs taken in the coal room. In several of the photos, an anomaly appeared, a dark shape, vaguely humanoid, in the corner of the room. It was not in all photos, only in some, as if the entity were appearing and disappearing. In one particularly clear photo, what appeared to be the shape of a monastic hood could be distinguished. When the Pritchard family returned home on Saturday the 14th of October, the house seemed quiet. Almost too quiet. It was as if Fred had been patiently waiting for their return. That night, during dinner, an incident occurred that would be widely reported in the local press. The family was sitting around the dining table trying to have a normal meal. Suddenly, the salt shaker in the center of the table began to tremble. Then it rose into the air, floated about 30 centimeters above the table, tilted, and poured all the salt in a perfect circle around Diane's plate. Then it was the pepper shaker's turn. It rose, floated, and poured pepper, forming a second circumference around the salt. It was as if something were drawing concentric circles around Diane, marking her in some way. Diane pushed her plate away and ran from the table, screaming. She would not eat at that table again for the rest of the time they lived in the house. On Sunday the 15th of October, Mrs. Mountain from number 32 had her own experience with the Black Monk. She was in her kitchen, preparing tea, when she saw a dark figure standing in her back garden, looking toward number 30. When she went out to investigate, the figure had disappeared. But she was sure of what she had seen, a tall figure dressed in black with a hood that hid its face. That same night, Vic Nottingham from number 28 heard what he described as the most terrifying sound I've heard in my life, coming from number 30. It was a long, high-pitched, inhuman howl. It was not the scream of a person. It was something more primordial, more ancient, more full of rage and pain. The third week of October brought with it the most violent incident up to that point. On Tuesday the 17th of October, at approximately 9 at night, Diane was in her room trying to read. Suddenly, something invisible grabbed her by the hair and began to drag her toward the stairs. Diane screamed and clung to her bedroom doorframe, but whatever had hold of her was incredibly strong. Jean ran upstairs and saw something that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. Her daughter being dragged slowly but inexorably down the hallway, desperately clinging to the doorframe, with her hair taut as if someone invisible were pulling it with all their strength. Jean grabbed Diane around the waist and tried to pull her back. For a moment, it was literally a tug-of-war between Jean and something she could not see. Diane screamed in pain, feeling her hair being torn from her scalp. Jean pulled with all her strength, screaming for help. Joe came running and joined Jean, both pulling on Diane. Finally, whatever had hold of her suddenly let go. The three of them fell backward in a heap on the hallway floor. Diane was sobbing uncontrollably, with strands of hair in her hands. Her scalp was bleeding in several places where the hair had been torn out by the roots. On her neck, clearly visible, were red marks. Finger marks. 5 marks on each side of her neck, as if invisible hands had grabbed her and tried to strangle her. It was then that Joe finally made the decision he had been avoiding for weeks. He called the police. It was late, past 10 at night, when 2 Yorkshire police officers arrived at number 30 East Drive. The senior officer, a man of about 50 years called Sergeant Davies, had heard rumors about the house, but did not believe at all in paranormal phenomena. He had come expecting to find evidence of a hoax or perhaps a mental health problem in the family. What he experienced that night would change his opinion forever. Davies and his companion, young Officer Thompson, entered the house and spoke with the family. They saw the marks on Diane's neck, saw the torn hair, saw the genuine fear in the eyes of these honest Yorkshire working people. While they were in the living room taking statements, the knocks began. First soft, then increasingly loud. Davies stood up and put his hand against the wall. He could feel the vibrations under his palm. Officer Thompson checked the other side of the wall in the adjoining room. There was nothing there that could be causing the knocks. Then, before their eyes, a chair in the living room began to move. It did not slide, did not tip over. It rose about 10 centimeters off the floor, moved approximately 1 meter toward the center of the room, and then deposited itself gently back on the floor. Officer Thompson, a young man of barely 25 years, visibly paled. "Sergeant," he said in a trembling voice, "did you just see what I saw?" "Yes," Davies replied. "I saw it." Both officers carefully checked the chair. There were no wires, no visible tricks. It was just a normal wooden chair. And yet they had both clearly seen it move on its own. Sergeant Davies wrote an official report that night. the first and possibly only British police report documenting paranormal phenomena witnessed by police officers on duty. The report would be filed in the Yorkshire Police Records, where it remains to this day, an extraordinary testimony of extraordinary events. The report said, in part, at 22:30 hours on the 17th of October 1966, I, Sergeant William Davies, and Officer Michael Thompson responded to a call at number 30 East Drive, Pontefract. During our visit, we witnessed phenomena that I cannot explain by conventional means. Specifically, I observed a chair move approximately 1 meter without visible physical contact. I also experienced strong knocks in the walls of the property without an identifiable source. The resident family appears to be experiencing genuine disturbing phenomena. I recommend that appropriate authorities be contacted, though I admit to being uncertain what those authorities would be in this unconventional case. Sergeant Davies' police report changed everything. What had been a local story whispered among neighbors became regional news, then national. The Pontefract and Castleford Express published an extensive article with the headline, "Police Confirm Inexplicable Phenomena in Local House." The Yorkshire Post followed. Soon, journalists from all over the country were knocking on the door of number 30 East Drive. The Pritchard family found themselves at the center of a media circus they had neither sought nor wanted. Photographers camped out on the street, waiting to capture something unusual. The curious drove slowly past the house, some even daring to approach the front garden. Mrs. Mountain was in her element, granting interviews to anyone who asked, embellishing every detail with her dramatic imagination. But for Joe and Jean, this was not entertainment. It was a living nightmare that was swallowing their family. Diane had begun to have night terrors so severe that Jean had to sleep with her every night, holding her while the girl trembled and sobbed. Phillip had become withdrawn and silent, barely eating, his school grades plummeting. Joe had lost more than 6 kilos, with deep circles under his eyes from sleepless nights. Jean was taking Valium prescribed by her GP just to be able to function during the day. On Monday the 23rd of October 1966, a team of investigators from the Society for Psychical Research from London arrived. They were 4 serious men with briefcases full of scientific equipment. Maurice Gross, an experienced investigator who would later become famous for the Enfield case, was part of the initial team that assessed number 30. They spent 3 full days in the house installing monitoring equipment in every room. They used motion detection cameras, infrared thermographs, electromagnetic detectors, and sophisticated audio recorders. They exhaustively interviewed each family member, the neighbors, Sergeant Davies, Father O'Brien, Tom Cuniff. During those 3 days, Fred seemed to be on his best behavior. There were some minor incidents, lights that flickered, occasional knocks in the walls, but nothing dramatic. The investigators began to wonder if the phenomenon had exhausted itself or if the presence of so many observers had inhibited it. But on the night of the 3rd day, just when the investigators were packing their equipment, Fred gave them a demonstration that none would ever forget. It was approximately 11 at night. 3 of the investigators were in the living room with Joe and Jean, reviewing notes and preparing to leave the next morning. The 4th investigator, a young man named Peter, was upstairs checking the equipment in the children's room, where Diane slept restlessly. Suddenly they heard Peter scream. They all ran upstairs. They found Peter standing in the hallway, pale and trembling, pointing toward the stairs. Before their eyes, the heavy grandfather clock that had been on the upper landing for weeks was moving. It was not sliding, not wobbling. It was lifting off the floor. The clock, which weighed at least 45 kilos, rose approximately 30 centimeters into the air, floated for about 5 agonizingly long seconds, and then was propelled toward the stairs. It fell rolling down the stairs with a deafening crash, the glass of its face shattering, the wood splintering, the internal mechanism destroyed. It stopped right at the foot of the stairs, right where anyone trying to leave the house would have been standing. The 5 adults stood motionless on the upper floor, looking at the remains of the clock scattered in the lower hallway. One of the investigators, an older man named Dr. Harrison with 30 years of experience in paranormal research, whispered, "In all my years, I have never seen anything with this force. This is extraordinary, and extraordinarily dangerous." Maurice Gross wrote in his official report, "The phenomenon at number 30 East Drive, Pontefract, exhibits characteristics of an extremely powerful poltergeist with psychokinesis capabilities that exceed anything previously documented in British research. The activity appears to center on the youngest daughter, Diane Pritchard, 12 years old. The entity shows intelligence, intentionality, and, most worryingly, an escalation of violent behavior. I recommend immediate intervention by religious authorities along with continuous psychological monitoring of the family." Based on this report, the Catholic Church decided to send not just a local priest, but an experienced exorcist. Father Michael O'Connor arrived from Liverpool on Saturday the 5th of November. He was a 60-year-old man, tall and thin, with a severe face marked by decades of spiritual battles. He had performed more than 20 exorcisms in his career, confronting what he firmly believed were demonic forces. Father O'Connor arrived with his exorcist's briefcase, a purple stole, silver crucifixes, several bottles of holy water brought directly from Rome, relics of saints, and the Rituale Romanum, the official exorcism book of the Catholic Church. He spent an hour talking privately with the family, assessing the situation, praying silently. He then announced that he would perform a complete exorcism of the property. It would not be a simple blessing like the one Father O'Brien had done. This would be a formal exorcism ritual, the type normally reserved for personal demonic possessions, but adapted to cleanse a place. The exorcism began at 6 in the evening on Saturday. Father O'Connor had asked the family to leave the house during the ritual, but Joe insisted on staying. Jean took the children to grandmother Sarah's house. Father O'Connor began in the coal room, the place that both he and Father O'Brien had identified as the epicenter of the dark presence. He donned his stole, opened his Rituale Romanum, and began to recite the ancient prayers in Latin. Exorcizo omnis spiritus imund in nomine Dei Patris omnipotentis. Almost immediately, the temperature in the small room dropped drastically. The priest's breath came out in clouds of vapor. The single light bulb in the room began to flicker violently. Father O'Connor continued, his voice firm and authoritative. In nomine Jesu Christi, Dei et Domini Nostri, intercedent Immaculata Virgin Dei Genitrix Maria. The door to the room slammed shut with such force that Joe, who was standing in the hallway, felt the displaced air. He tried to open the door, but it was stuck as if something were pressing it from inside. He could hear Father O'Connor continuing the prayers, his voice now competing with a growing sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. After what seemed like hours but was only 20 minutes, the door burst open. Father O'Connor emerged, sweating profusely despite the cold, his face pale but determined. "There is something here," he said breathlessly. "Something ancient. Something that does not want to leave." He continued the exorcism throughout the entire house, room by room. In each space, he sprinkled holy water generously, traced crosses in the air with his crucifix, recited the powerful prayers of the Roman ritual. In some rooms, the process proceeded without incidents. In others, particularly in Diane's room, the resistance was palpable. The curtains fluttered violently without wind, objects trembled on the shelves, the air filled with a nauseating smell like rotting flesh. When he finally finished, near 10 at night, Father O'Connor was exhausted. He told Joe he had done everything he could, that he had used the most powerful rituals available to the church. But he also admitted something disturbing. This entity is unusually strong. I have felt resistance before, but never like this. It is as if something is clinging to this house, to this land, with a force that goes beyond my experience. I will pray for you. Keep your faith. And especially keep your daughter close. During the next 3 days, there was a wonderful calm at number 30. There were no knocks, no objects moving, no apparitions. Jean dared to hope that the exorcism had worked, that finally Fred had left. But Fred had not left. He was simply gathering strength. On Wednesday the 9th of November, exactly 3 days after the exorcism, Fred returned with a vengeance. And this time he seemed to be furious at what he had perceived as an attack. The walls of the house began to sweat holy water. Puddles of liquid appeared on the walls, dripping downward, soaking the wallpaper. Jean tested the liquid with her finger and brought it to her lips. It was definitely holy water. She could taste the slight bitterness of water that had been consecrated. It was as if the house were rejecting the blessing, expelling it from its pores. That night, the crosses that Father O'Connor had hung in each room appeared torn from the walls and piled in the center of the living room. But they were not simply randomly piled. They were deliberately arranged upside down, forming inverted crosses, a symbol of blasphemy and defiance. Diane, who had been sleeping in the living room since the incident of being dragged down the stairs, woke up screaming. Something was writing on the wall next to the sofa where she slept. Letters appeared as if an invisible hand were carving them into the plaster. The letters were crude, scratched deeply into the wall. They formed a single word in Old English, "Emily, mine." Jean immediately called Father O'Connor. When the priest saw the inverted crosses and the word carved into the wall, his face darkened. "This has gone beyond a common poltergeist," he said gravely. This shows characteristics of a demonic infestation, and it is claiming territory, specifically claiming your daughter. Father O'Connor contacted the diocese, requesting permission for a major exorcism, possibly even with a team of priests. But the bureaucratic process was slow. Meanwhile, the family had to live with Fred's increasingly aggressive presence. Tom Cuniff and Colin Wilson continued to meticulously document every incident. Colin Wilson, in particular, spent weeks in Pontefract, interviewing dozens of witnesses, reviewing all the physical evidence, analyzing the audio recordings and photographs. His fascination with the case would eventually lead to his book, Poltergeist, a study in destructive haunting, published in 1981, which dedicated an entire chapter to the Pontefract case. In November of 1966, Colin Wilson brought a medium named Margaret, a middle-aged woman with supposed psychic abilities. Margaret entered number 30 and almost immediately entered what she described as a trance state. She began to speak with a voice that was not hers, a deep, masculine voice with an accent that sounded archaic. "This is my land," the voice said through Margaret. "I was hanged here, buried here without rite or prayer. The girl, she is like the other, the one I took before they caught me. I must have what was denied me." When Margaret came out of the trance, she was pale and trembling. She told the family that the entity was indeed the spirit of an executed monk, but not a spirit seeking forgiveness or rest. It was a spirit filled with hatred, anger, and unsatisfied appetites. He had committed atrocities in life and apparently felt no remorse in death. Colin Wilson investigated the historical archives of Pontefract with renewed interest. In the library's local records, he found references to a case from 1537 during the reign of Henry VIII. A Cluniac monk from Pontefract Priory had been accused of the rape and murder of a local girl. The record did not give his name, only identified him as a brother of the Black Order. He had been tried, condemned, and executed on the public gallows on the Crossroads Hill, exactly where East Drive now stood. His body had been thrown into a well without Christian blessing. And the girl he had murdered was 12 years old, the same age as Diane. This information, far from reassuring anyone, only intensified the fear. If the black monk was somehow drawn to Diane because she reminded him of his original victim, what were his intentions? Was he simply tormenting her, or was there something more sinister at play? In December, Joe finally made a drastic decision. With a broken heart but desperate, he sent Diane to live with his brother Robert and his wife Mary in Bradford, about 40 kilometers away. If the activity was centered on Diane, he reasoned, then getting her away from the house might both protect her and calm Fred. During the first 2 weeks Diane was away, the activity at number 30 decreased dramatically. There were some minor incidents, occasional knocks, flickering lights, but nothing compared to the terror of previous months. Jean dared to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could have a normal Christmas if Diane stayed with Robert. But Diane was miserable in Bradford. She missed her family, her school, her friends. She called her mother every day, crying, begging to come home. She was having the same nightmares she had had in Pontefract, dreaming of the dark hooded figure chasing her. It was as if Fred could reach her even kilometers away. Moreover, Mary reported some strange incidents in her own house after Diane arrived. Knocks in the walls. Objects falling off shelves. As if something had followed Diane to Bradford. On the 20th of December, unable to bear the separation and her daughter's unhappiness any longer, Jean drove to Bradford and brought Diane back home. When Diane crossed the threshold of number 30, Jean swore she heard a sound. A low, triumphant, malevolent laugh. Fred had recovered his prey. That Christmas of 1966 was the darkest the Pritchard family had ever experienced. They tried to maintain traditions, a decorated tree, gifts, Christmas dinner. But it was like acting out a play, going through the motions without any real joy. Everyone felt Fred's lurking presence, waiting, watching, ready to resume his torment. And on Boxing Day, the 26th of December, Fred gave them his Christmas gift. All the photographs in the house, every framed family photograph, every photo album, showed the same creepy damage. All the faces had been scratched out, erased as if an invisible claw had scraped each face until it was unrecognizable. Years of family memories, destroyed in a single night of concentrated malice. Jean sat on the living room floor, surrounded by destroyed photographs, and cried. Not silent tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the depths of her soul. Joe held her, without words of comfort, because there were no words that could make this better. And so ended 1966, the year that had begun with hopes of a new home and had degenerated into a living nightmare. But for the Pritchard family, this was only the beginning. Fred was not finished with them yet. He had not even reached his peak of power. What would come in 1967 and 68 would be even more intense, more terrifying, more publicly documented. Number 30 East Drive had become a landmark in British paranormal research, a case that would challenge all rational explanations and leave investigators, priests, police officers and skeptics alike without satisfactory answers. And Diane Pritchard, the quiet girl who only wanted to read books and draw horses, had unwittingly become the battlefield of a war between the natural and the supernatural, between the world of the living and something ancient and malevolent from the world of the dead. The year 1967 brought with it a continuation of the torment, though with a puzzling pattern. Fred's activity became more erratic, more unpredictable. Entire weeks could pass without incidents, allowing the family to breathe with hope that perhaps it had ended. Then, without warning, Fred would return with renewed fury, shattering that hope to pieces. In March of 1967, Diane turned 13. On her birthday, Fred gave her a particularly cruel gift. All the dolls she had kept from her childhood, carefully stored in her room, appeared destroyed. Not simply broken, but deliberately mutilated. Heads torn off, limbs twisted, eyes ripped from their porcelain sockets. They were arranged in a circle on her room floor, as if they had been victims of some macabre ritual. During that year, Tom Cuniff and Colin Wilson continued their exhaustive documentation. They installed permanent monitoring equipment in the house, with the family's permission. The recorders ran 24 hours, capturing hours and hours of audio. The cameras took photographs at regular intervals. The electromagnetic detectors registered strange fluctuations in the house's magnetic field, particularly in the coal room and in Diane's room. Colin Wilson spent countless hours interviewing not only the family but all witnesses, neighbors, police officers, priests, investigators. He meticulously reviewed all the historical archives of Pontefract, tracing the history of the land where East Drive was built. His research confirmed what the medium had said. A monk had been executed at that place in 1537, and his victim had been a girl of approximately 12 years old. In September of 1967, one of the most widely witnessed and documented incidents of the entire case occurred. A Daily Mirror journalist, Douglas Bence, and a photographer, Graham Morris, spent 3 consecutive days in the house, waiting to capture evidence of paranormal activity. On the afternoon of the second day, they were in Diane's room with the family when something extraordinary occurred. Diane was sitting on her bed, reading, when suddenly her body went rigid. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. And then, before the eyes of 6 adults, Diane began to levitate. It was not a dramatic levitation of several meters as depicted in movies. It was more subtle but equally impossible. Her body rose approximately 15 centimeters above the mattress and remained suspended there for what witnesses estimated was between 10 and 15 seconds. Graham Morris took several photographs in rapid succession. Jean screamed and ran to grab her daughter, and the moment her hands touched Diane, the girl fell back onto the bed, blinking confused, remembering nothing of what had happened. The photographs taken by Morris were published in the Daily Mirror and caused a national sensation. Skeptics argued they were fakes or photographic tricks, but Morris, a professional photographer with decades of experience, swore the images were authentic and unmanipulated. The photographs were subjected to analysis by experts, who found no evidence of alteration. That incident brought the Pontefract case to national and even international attention. The BBC sent a team to make a documentary. Paranormal investigators from all over Europe requested permission to study the house. The Pritchard family, who had only wanted a quiet life in their modest Yorkshire house, found themselves at the center of a media phenomenon. But public scrutiny came at a price. Diane became an object of ridicule at school. Children called her the ghost girl and made "oh" noises when she passed through the hallways. Teachers did not know how to handle the situation. Some were sympathetic, others clearly thought it was all an elaborate hoax. Diane became increasingly withdrawn, barely speaking, spending most of her time in her room or at the library. Phillip, now 17 years old, had begun to have behavioral problems. He drank with friends, skipped classes, got into fights. Years later, in interviews, he would admit that he was acting out because he did not know how to process the trauma of living with Fred. He could not talk about it with his friends because no one would understand. He could not escape it because it was his home. So he rebelled in the only ways he knew. Joe had begun to have health problems. The constant stress, the sleepless nights, the feeling of helplessness at not being able to protect his family, all had taken their toll. He developed stomach ulcers and high blood pressure. His doctor warned him that he needed to reduce stress or risk a nervous breakdown or worse. Jean was the one holding the family together, but she too was falling apart. She was taking increasingly more Valium just to get through the day. She had lost weight dramatically, with a gaunt face and eyes always red from crying. Her Catholic faith, which had once been her rock, was being severely tested. Why would God allow this to happen to her family? What had they done to deserve this torment? And then, as mysteriously as it had begun, the activity simply stopped. In February of 1968, after 18 months of almost constant phenomena, Fred went silent. There were no knocks, no objects moving, no apparitions of the Black Monk. Number 30 East Drive became normal. At first, the family did not dare believe it. They waited every day for Fred to return. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing happened. The house was just a house. Diane slept without nightmares. Jean was able to gradually reduce her medication. Joe began to smile again. Investigators had theories about why the activity had ceased. Some suggested that Diane, going through puberty and becoming a teenager, was no longer the type of target the Black Monk sought. Others theorized that the entity had exhausted its energy after 18 months of intense activity. Some speculated that perhaps the multiple exorcisms and blessings had worked after all, just with a significant delay. But no one really knew. And that uncertainty meant the family could never completely relax. There was always a part of them waiting for Fred to return. Life continued. Phillip finished secondary school in 1969 and began working as an electrician's apprentice. Diane, now 14 years old, began to slowly recover from the trauma. She made new friends, began to smile again, though the shadows never completely left her eyes. Joe and Jean tried to return to normalcy. They repaired the damage to the house, the scratched walls, the destroyed photographs, the broken furniture. They redecorated, trying to cover the physical memories of those 18 months of horror. But no amount of new paint could erase what they had experienced. In 1972, when Diane was 18 and preparing to leave for university, Fred returned briefly. It was just a week of activity. Knocks in the walls, flickering lights, the unmistakable smell of rotting flesh in the cold room. Then it stopped again as abruptly as it had begun. It was as if Fred were saying goodbye, or perhaps warning that he had never really left. Diane left to study in Leeds, leaving Pontefract and number 30 East Drive behind. She swore she would never live in that house again, a promise she kept. Phillip moved in with his girlfriend in 1973. Joe and Jean stayed at number 30 for a few more years, mainly because they could not afford to move, but also because Jean, with her characteristic Yorkshire stubbornness, refused to let Fred throw her out of her home. Finally, in 1977, 11 years after moving in, Joe and Jean moved to a smaller house in another Pontefract neighborhood. They never spoke publicly about why they moved, but those close to them knew it was to escape the memories, if not Fred himself. Number 30 East Drive had several tenants in the following years. Curiously, none of them reported significant paranormal experiences. There were some minor incidents, lights that occasionally flickered, the feeling of being watched, but nothing comparable to what the Pritchard family had experienced. This led some skeptics to argue that the whole story had been an elaborate hoax perpetrated by the family. But that theory crumbled under scrutiny. Why would a working-class Yorkshire family invent a story that only brought them misery, public scrutiny, and lasting trauma? They did not gain significant money from it. They did not seek fame. In fact, after moving, they declined most interview requests, simply wanting to forget and move on. And there was the evidence. Sergeant Davies' official police report. The photographs taken by Graham Morris. Hours of audio recordings. The testimonies of dozens of witnesses. Neighbors, investigators, priests, journalists. Colin Wilson's meticulously researched book, Poltergeist, a study in destructive haunting, published in 1981, which dedicated an extensive chapter to the case, supporting its authenticity. Colin Wilson wrote in his book, "The Pontefract case remains one of the most compelling in the history of paranormal research. The combination of multiple credible witnesses, documented physical evidence, and the consistency of accounts over time makes it extremely difficult to dismiss as fraud or collective hysteria. Whatever happened at number 30 East Drive, it was real to those who experienced it, and that reality left deep and lasting scars." Joe Pritchard died in 1998 at 70 years old from heart failure. Until his last days, he maintained that everything he had witnessed at East Drive was real. "I don't know what it was," he said in one of his last interviews. "I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something completely different. But I know what I saw. I know what we lived through. And it wasn't imagination." Jean lived until 2011, reaching 83 years. She spent her last years in a nursing home, where she occasionally talked to staff about the dark years, as she called that time at East Drive. Until the end, she maintained her Catholic faith, though she admitted it had been severely tested. God did not abandon us, she would say. He simply tested us in ways I could never have imagined. Diane, now a 60-year-old woman, lives in southern England with her husband and children. She rarely speaks publicly about her experience in Pontefract. In an interview in 2015, she said, "Those 18 months shaped the rest of my life. They made me stronger, but they also left scars that will never completely heal. I still have nightmares. I still get nervous in old houses. But I survived. That's what matters." Phillip became a successful electrician and moved to Australia in the 90s. He speaks even less than his sister about the Pontefract events, preferring to leave that chapter of his life firmly in the past. But the story of number 30 East Drive did not end when the Pritchard family moved out. In 2012, film director Pat Holden, who happened to be related to Jean Pritchard, made a film based on the events. When the lights went out, took creative liberties with the story but captured the essence of the terror the family had experienced. The film renewed public interest in the case. That same year, a businessman named Bill Bungay bought number 30 East Drive. It had been empty for some time, with a reputation that made it difficult to sell. Bungay, fascinated by paranormal history, decided to convert the house into an attraction for paranormal investigators and horror enthusiasts. And here is where the story becomes even stranger. After decades of silence, after multiple tenants reported nothing unusual, paranormal activity at number 30 apparently began again. Visitors to the house began to report experiences: drastic temperature changes, particularly in the coal room, the sensation of being touched by invisible hands, dark shadows moving in peripheral vision, objects falling from shelves, and in some cases apparitions of a tall, dark figure dressed in what appeared to be a monastic robe. Paranormal investigation teams from around the world have visited number 30, including the television program Most Haunted, which filmed a live special on Halloween 2015. During that broadcast, multiple team members reported disturbing experiences, though skeptics argue that the program's entertainment format makes it unreliable as evidence. Today, in 2025, number 30 East Drive still stands on the corner of Chequerfield Estate in Pontefract. From the outside, it is indistinguishable from neighboring houses, a modest red brick semi-detached house, built in the 50s with a small front and back garden. If you drive past it, you would have no idea of the dark history it contains. But those who know the story, those who have investigated the case, those who have spent the night inside those walls, have a different story to tell. They speak of a palpable presence, particularly in the coal room. They speak of a feeling of being watched, of an ancient malevolence that still clings to the property. The question that remains unanswered, the question that has obsessed investigators for nearly 60 years, is simple. What really was Fred? Was it the spirit of an executed 16th century monk, bound to the land where he was hanged, somehow seeking to repeat his crime through Diane? Was it a manifestation of psychokinetic energy generated by Diane herself during the stress of early adolescence, as some parapsychologists suggest? Was it something older and darker than the monk, something that simply used that legend as a mask? Or was it, as the staunchest skeptics maintain, a combination of human error, misinterpretation, and possibly some fraud, though evidence of fraud remains extremely weak? The truth, as so often happens with the paranormal, will probably never be known with certainty. What is undeniable is the impact that the events at number 30 East Drive had on everyone involved. Lives were permanently altered. The trauma was real, documented by medical professionals who treated the family. The scars, both physical and psychological, remained. The Pontefract case, along with the Vallecas file in Spain and the Enfield poltergeist in London, stands among the best documented in all of paranormal research history. It has multiple independent and credible witnesses. It has physical evidence that has withstood decades of scrutiny. It has official documentation from authorities who are normally skeptical of the paranormal. And it has the continuing mystery of why. Why that house? Why that family? Why Diane specifically? 60 years after it began, the Black Monk of Pontefract remains one of the greatest enigmas of British paranormal phenomena. Number 30 East Drive has become a landmark, a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the inexplicable. And on quiet nights at Chequerfield Estate, if you listen carefully, some say you can still hear rhythmic knocks coming from the walls of that corner house. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. As if something or someone is still there, waiting patiently in the darkness. remembering a 12-year-old girl with pigtails and frightened brown eyes. Fred never really left number 30 East Drive. And perhaps he never will.